unconditionally good. That is to say, a good will. Goodwill. The focus is on intention, on motive, on character, the inner disposition of the individual. And it's only the goodness of that inner moral disposition that can be regarded as good without qualification. After all, our natural inclinations can be twisted, diverted, perverted. Our desires may be self-indulgent, you see. So that our desire for happiness is not something that is in itself good and right. It can be misdirected. So he makes a clear distinction between, on the one hand, inclinations, because inclinations are towards empirical objects. Okay? A clear distinction between inclinations on the one hand and the sense of duty on the other hand. The sense of duty is referring back to the a priori principle. The inclinations are looking forward to empirical satisfactions. And the moral quality is involved in the former. He makes the distinction another way by talking about hypothetical imperatives as distinct from categorical imperatives. Well, you know the difference between a hypothetical proposition and a categorical proposition. A hypothetical one is iffy. If you want this, then do that. It would be a sort of a hypothetical moral syllogism. If you want this, then do that. So that hypothetical imperatives are oriented to ends, outcomes, consequences, inclinations, desires, okay? And they're not unqualifiedly good. On the other hand, categorical imperatives are not iffy at all, you see. Without qualification, categorical imperative tells you what's right. So while he starts by saying the only unconditionally good thing is acting out of a sense of will, he develops that notion of the completely unconditional imperative. It's the goodwill, yes, to act out of respect for duty, not just in accordance with duty. Kant's not saying, do your duty. Well, not saying just that, because he knows perfectly well that you can do your duty for the wrong reason. Like you can observe the speed limit because there's a cop car following. No moral virtue in that, you see. But doing one's duty out of respect for duty is the sort of thing that he's after. Then he goes on to develop that more fully, going that far alone, he calls common sense morality. Because it is, in effect, the kind of common morality which many ordinary people in the street would immediately describe. But he goes on to develop it in his more philosophical way in trying to articulate his categorical imperative, which he presents in three forms. One is often referred to as the universalizability principle. The second is referred to nowadays as the principle of respect for persons, and the third as the autonomy of the will, the autonomous will. A word about each of these. Universalizability. That you should always act according to a maxim. A maxim is a moral rule. According to a maxim that you could will as universal moral law. Always act according to a maxim that you could will as a universal moral law. And two interpretations of that have developed. One is, would it be something which you could get enacted? And that is to say that all persons would recognize as morally binding. Universalizability. The other, more usual interpretation, is that is it logically possible to will that? Now, something that's not logically possible to will would be a self-contradiction. So if you cannot logically will it to be a universal moral law, it's because it would turn out to be a self-contradictory law, a self-defeating thing. If, for instance, you're trying to take a loan and promise to, with a promise to repay it by a certain date, knowing and intending fully well not to repay it, you are in effect with no intention to keep the promise. Now, the maxim on which you're acting, if universalized, would be something like everybody could, if they wished, make promises without in two senses. One, you're really not making a promise. You're making a promise which is not a promise. Second, you are destroying the whole institution of promising by the universal law. There would be no such thing as promise. So it would be a victory. So the categorical imperative then stated in that way. The problem with that formulation is that it provides a negative criterion telling you what you cannot do rather than a positive criterion. A negative criterion rather than a positive criterion. Now, Kant, however, goes on to a second formulation that nowadays gets known as respect for persons. His way of putting it is that we should always, there's the universalizability carried over into this, we should always treat persons as ends in themselves rather than as means only. Never treat a person only as a means. Always as an end. Now, he's not saying never treat persons as means. We do that all the time. You're using me right now to get some credit. And I'm using you to earn a living. Yeah, he's not saying that's wrong. But he is saying that in the ways in which we use people, treat those people as of value in themselves. You see. And why that? Well, because they're rational people with moral will as you. You see. So it's really universalizing what I ask for myself, that I be respected as a rational being, able to make moral decisions. Universalizing that, it applies to you. Now, that emphasis on respect for persons has been made a great deal of use of in, for instance, contemporary medical ethics and business ethics. It's been developed at University of Chicago, now retired, but still around, has principle like this when he says that if I ask respect for my life project, then consistency requires that I respect your life project. Why do I ask respect for mine? Because I'm a rational, self-determining being, you see. So he argues for a principle of generic consistency, as he calls it, the principle of generic consistency. PGC, it gets known. And this is really the universalization of respect for persons. So that's the second way of stating the categorical imperative, and obviously it has much more positive application. Now, it seems to me that one of the difficulties with this is that what it means to respect a person really depends on how you define a person. And if you're not satisfied with the sufficiency of defining a person simply as a rational being, but if there is more to the notion of personhood, then that needs to be spelled out. You see. And I'm inclined to argue that there is more to it. Therefore, this is an incomplete ethic. The third version of the categorical imperative involves his distinction between the autonomous will and, on the other hand, the heteronymous will. Now, a heteronymous will is one that is ruled by another. Heteronomy, governed by another. Autonomy means, of course, self-government. The autonomous will is one that is self-governed. His point, basically, is that the categorical imperative requires that you act out of your own good will. You see, it's coming back to that notion. That it be a free act, self-determined, acting of your own will, rather than being governed, driven by other people's desires and expectations, going along with the crowd, conforming to social pressures, following your own desires rather than acting out of free will, enslaved by your own inclinations. So that's the basic distinction. Not ties in